work with your anima, but nobody says anything about how is it that every single person may have this. And
okay, we're going out to YouTube, by the way.
Okay.
And also, Nick, I mean, people, they want reasons. They want a bunch of BS, only empirical stuff instead of the both and they try to negate the soul stuff, the heart stuff with mind stuff. And I laughed that my old boss wrote this: beauty, neuroscience, and architecture.
Wow.
Timeless patterns and their impact on our well-being. And I laughed when I got this. I had formed the architectural well-being about 3 years before. And I'm like, well, our apples didn't fall too far from the same tree. I mean, but he's then going through the metaphysical and neuroscientific data as well as architectural form to bring this about, not directly in a Jungian fashion, but in a fashion that's so much an allied field.
Yeah. Okay.
And I mean, when I got this book, so go ahead.
Show us some pictures out of that book so we can see what you're referring to.
I want to throw one thing in here really quickly while we're seeing.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
And this maybe can be a launching point, but there's one notion that I've been grappling with personally, and it comes from some other schools of thought as well, but I'm really trying to reconcile this within Jungian thought. But at what point is something just so true that even without the text, which describe Jungian thought or any school of thought, at what point are they so true that they would ultimately more or less recapitulate themselves through people's experience? I'm asking that question because you said not necessarily from a Jungian stance. And I'm wondering if, I guess the hypothetical that I'm kind of trying to walk around here is that if Jungian thought is really true in all of its structural components, would it not be true that everything would kind of be Jungian?
Eventually, it will be so. But an example would be, from 325 AD, from the Council of Nicaea on until at least 1500. Nobody questioned the Bible, or if they did, they got burned at the stake.
Right, and it's strange to me that the historians of the time did not chronicle Jesus' miracles. I mean, so they appear in the Bible, and so there's a fairy tale aspect of embellishment potentially, or things that happen to be just avoided by the historians. I mean, there could have been a political omission there. So pictures in this book, I'll start out, the quote in the frontispiece is by Renzo Piano, the architect, from a Charlie Rose.
Show the cover again so that the audience knows what we're talking about. Okay, beauty, neuroscience, and architecture.
And it's timeless patterns.
And their impact
on our well-being. And there's an image from, I think, Tuscany right there.
Yeah, sure.
And with that, it opens into Renzo Piano's quote: "I believe in the redemptive power of beauty. Beauty is not romantic. Beauty is profound. Beauty is one of the most important emotions in life. Beauty can save the world one person at a time. I am sure of that." And then the next picture is again the cover of this scene.
Is that an actual photo or is that a painting?
Yes,
that's a photo.
Oh, wow.
That's a photo?
That's a photo.
I guess that's telling of how beautiful of a place it is.
Yeah, because it has that painterly quality that has that emotive gesture.
Yeah.
And then we open up with a simple form.
Okay. Who would you give me the author's name, because one of the YouTube followers is asking for the author's name.
Yes, it's Donald H. Ruggles, Ruggles.
Okay. And it's beauty, neuroscience,
And architecture. Subtext or subtitle, timeless patterns and their impact on our well-being. And then a more mundane, but no less beautiful, in a different context, shade, shadow, villa, courtyard. Simple.
Yeah, I think that the human species selects for beauty. And that's why, there's so many beautiful women around the world. And it's why there's so many men that women consider beautiful around the world. Okay, because I think we unconsciously select for beauty. And it will out.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and I think there's not an immutable quality to it. We each have our own definition. I each have our own. That strikes a chord to resonate. But at the same time, the fact that it does is a call to well-being, where beauty. I love that Renzo Piano actually called beauty an emotion, because that to me breaks ground. That it's not just happy, sad, glad, mad, not just that little diagram in psychology. It becomes more robust and more expansive.
Yeah. So Good Buddy Time says, I guess this is Neil, who says, hey guys, freezing. Well, a month ago I was really freezing on the California coast.
Yeah.
I'm doing all right now.
We can't go to Hawaii and get 12 inches of snow right now.
No, I'm in very temperate Annapolis, Maryland.
Yeah.
You might be cold, Nick, I guess.
It's cooling off, certainly. It's been warm this past week and weekend, but we're expecting some snow this week. So
we are too. Part of me doubts it, but at the same time, it's I canned my winter plan. I'm not going inside. I'm just going to read. It's 65 degrees during the day. And if I need to take a couple weeks off, I'll just write. I mean, I'm not going to play a big mumbo jumbo to change my whole business plan. I just canned the winter plan of going inside because it's not going to be months and months anymore.
Yeah. Okay, let us begin here on paragraph 104 of 2 essays on analytical psychology. And here we're getting into the divine drama. Would either of you wish to define the divine drama?
No. No, I think we got past 104 last week because I do recall reading this paragraph.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, we did.
You did read it, but we said we would come back to it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't think the divine drama. I don't think I would speak to it in a definition, but I would put one word to it, and that's life.
Yeah, I was
in a full way. In a full way.
Right. Okay.
I'll give
Nick?
my definition. Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
I mean, first of all, Edinger has another really outstanding book called The Eternal Drama. Very similar concept, I'm sure derived from some similar lines in Jung.
Yeah.
But the divine drama, let's see. It seems like it's a drama with different characters with the same themes eternally playing out.
Nice. Yep. Like that.
Yep. And fundamentally you could if you mixed up Job and Christ in the same breath, and you looked at their lives, that represents the divine drama, actually. In other words, Job was having problems with, disease, weather, faithless friends, all kinds of things in the book of Job, right?
Just life stuff.
Just life stuff. We have it here, and he was an early Iron Age man, and so he didn't necessarily know what he was seeing, and so when the whirlwind came along, he saw a certain thing that wasn't necessarily what was actually happening, but that was his perception at the time.
Definitely. And actually, I like that you putting Job and Jesus in the same breath. Philly Macron, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, yep. Last week in our group on Wednesday, really lit up, formed to an idea of, I have always had water conforms to its cup until it's ready to grow, and then it breaks the cup or leaves. But he said, you fit in a group completely until you don't fit anymore, when it's time for the king to die, to grow, and a new king to be reborn. And that's the Job and the Jesus story too.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, the point is that we all have to develop through our lifetime. Nick maybe is a little young to have experienced this at it sufficiently as yet, but I can certainly vouch for it.
Well, and I'd actually say that because of Nick's late teenage, early 20 experiences, you did your dark, you did your rite of passage, you came through, and that's one of those experiences that repeats through life in different forms, regardless of age. I mean, that passage, and I know when, I think it was last year, maybe around this time, you mentioned, cursorily, not TMI, but about your late teens and 20s, and that I think that was probably incredibly formative, and as to who you are now, and such a, it probably wasn't fun then, but now you can draw on that well of experience.
Oh, it was a ton of fun, and that was the problem.
Too much fun. There you go.
Well, it's like one of my daughter's psychology chairman at University of Rochester said, "Have your dessert first."
Yeah.
Your life might be short, so you might as well have your dessert first.
But I'm in a line at a chocolate coffee shop several weeks ago, and someone said, "Oh, too much chocolate," and I went, "Too much chocolate? That's the definition of impossible." And and the owner said, "Can you make that into it? I know you made your mask. Can you make that into a shirt? We can sell those." So they're in production right now.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. But the same kind of thing of have your dessert first. There's chocolate. What could be wrong with chocolate?
Right. And okay, so I will read.
Okay.
I will read the first paragraph that was read last week, and then you can go on, Nick. The primordial images are the most ancient and the most universal thought forms of humanity. They are as much feelings as thoughts. Indeed, they lead their own independent life rather in the manner of part souls, as can easily be seen in those philosophical or Gnostic systems which rely on perception of the unconscious as the source of knowledge. The idea
you skipped a line that is seen in those philosophical or Gnostic systems. You missed that line.
I thought I read it, but as can easily be seen in these philosophical and Gnostic systems, which rely on perception of the unconscious as the source of knowledge. The idea of angels, archangels, principalities, and powers in St. Paul, the archons in the Gnostics, the heavenly hierarchy of Dionysus, the Areopagite, all come from the perception of the relative autonomy of the archetypes. Okay, so go on, Nick.
Okay. We have now found the object which the libido chooses when it is freed from the personal infantile form of transference. It follows its own gradient down into the depths of the unconscious, and there activates what has lain slumbering from the beginning. It has discovered the hidden treasure upon which mankind ever and on has drawn, and from which it has raised up its gods and demons, all those potent and mighty thoughts without which man ceases to be man.
Okay. Jordan, do you want to read the next paragraph so that we
Certainly get the whole gist, because these were three work together. Let us take an example. Let us take as an example one of the greatest thoughts which the 19th century brought to birth, the idea of the conservation of energy. Robert Mayer, the real creator of this idea, was a physician and not a physicist or natural philosopher, for whom the making of such an idea would have been more appropriate. But it is very important to realize that the idea was not, strictly speaking, made by Mayer, nor did it come into being through the fusion of ideas or scientific hypotheses, then extant, but grew in its creator like a plant. Mayer wrote about it in the following way to Greisinger in 1844, quoting his letter: "I am far from having hatched out the theory at my writing desk." He then reports certain physiological observations he had made in 1840 and 1841 as ship's doctor. Now, if one wants to be clear on matters of physiology, some knowledge of physical processes is essential, unless one prefers to work at things from the metaphysical side, which I find infinitely disgusting. I therefore held fast to physics and stuck to the subject with such fondness that, although many may laugh at me for this, I paid but little attention to that remote quarter of the globe in which we were, preferring to remain on board where I could work without intermission, and where I passed many an hour as though inspired, in quotes, or in italics, the like of which I cannot remember either before or since a numinous experience. Some flashes of thought that passed through me while in the roads of Surabaya were at once assiduously followed up, and in their turn led to fresh subjects. Those times have passed, but the quiet examination of that which then came to the surface in me has taught me that it is a truth which can not only be subjectively felt, but objectively proved. It remains to be seen whether this can be accomplished by a man so little versed in physics as I am. And footnote 7, he just refers to Kleine Schriften und Brief, which is a letter to William Greisinger, June 16th, 1844.
Right. Okay. So comments, Nick.
Let's see. Yeah, I don't know that I have anything yet.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is a rebus and what that is.
A rebus?
Yeah. And this is a psychological form that, hold on just a second, I gotta admit Brendan here. This is a psychological form that comes up between people. Typically it comes up between spouses, but it also comes up in national psyches. And that is that unconsciously, whether you intend for it to happen or not, you tend to become what the new country is. Okay, so an immigrant And I'm not exactly sure why I'm talking about this but it is in my notes on the side of the page. So I guess I thought it was important at the time. But an immigrant, for example, after he's been in the United States for 5 years, then he can become a U.S. citizen. And the reason is because he has become more like other Americans than he is like other, let's say, Indians or Mexicans or what have you. And it's just something that happens automatically and unconsciously. But in a marriage, there's a famous Billy Joel lyric that says, "You're the only one who knows." And so in a marriage or in any relationship, including this one, for example, we're the only ones that know why we come back every week, okay, in some sense. And in a marriage, the marital partners are the only ones that know what has transpired in the relationship. And so anyway, that was my thought. And then why did I go ahead?
Skip, I'm glad you wrote that down as important, because I underlined the conservation of energy. And in my marginalia, I wrote a self-fulfilling system of the personal and collective unconscious, ... in a person, ... in an immigrant, ... in a marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So, and so it's that shifting focus and redirecting scale, but it's still the same system, just at different scales. So if I take a cell, there's a whole universe there. If I take a world, there's a whole universe there. If I take a universe, obviously there's a whole universe there. But if I shift focus just to redirect the scale, they're all the same. There's infinity in all. So when I then pour in the collective and personal unconscious into that, we get the notion of influence that then is encapsulated or embraced in the conservation of energy. There's nothing gained, nothing lost, but things develop and evolve.
Mm-hmm.
But I laughed that I put ... in a marriage also. I mean, it was like, well, okay, we kind of filled the margin in a similar way.
Yeah. At least we were thinking in a similar way when we read this. And what came to mind for me in general is that the divine drama is actually presented by the Bible, and it's been sold by the church as the experience of one man, at least in Christian circles. It's been sold by the church as the experience of one man, but in actuality, it's all of our experience. We are all crucified. We all suffer, and in various ways we have to learn to live with it. And
that's a great point, because I also wrote comma, in regards to conservation of energy, also E = mc squared.
Yeah.
Other than the speed of light constant of c, you change the energy, then you change the mass. You change the mass, you change the energy. So there's a proportionate quality to the conservation of energy, which I'll then drop back to my shift focus, redirect scale. There's still simply a world there, or a universe.
Right. And as Jung said in a letter to the Reverend David Cox, while all of this may be a sort of theological speculation, may seem to be, it is in reality modern man's perplexity expressed in symbolic terms. It is the problem I so often had to deal with in treating the neuroses of intelligent patients. it can be expressed in a more scientific psychological language. For instance, instead of using the term God, you say unconscious. Instead of Christ, self. Instead of incarnation, integration of the unconscious. Instead of salvation and redemption, individuation. And instead of crucifixion or sacrifice on the cross, realization of the four functions or of wholeness. I think it is no disadvantage to religious tradition if we can see how far it coincides with psychological experience. On the contrary, it seems to me a most welcome aid in understanding religious traditions. Do you want to comment on that, or does Brendan?
I've just come in, so that's one thing. But I do like what you're saying about so many things. I know you're a deeply religious person, Skip, and through the Presbyterian tradition, I've learned so much from you about Christology, about the myth making of the whole order. For instance, I was sharing with my therapist on Thursday our wonderful session that we had about symbolism and metaphor with that Trappist monk last Wednesday.
Mm-hmm.
It was a truly terrific session.
Yeah, Philippe Macron.
Yeah, I can't, and often I'm working in the middle of the day. I can't stay for everything, but this too I love because the church has sold it as a story of one man, but it is every man's struggle.
And every woman's too. It's not only men.
Yeah, I mean every man, like Samuel Johnson said, or every person. Yeah. And it's outrageous to me still when I think of the church giving itself the power over destiny, controlling and coercing people through hellfire and damnation to conform to a particular way of behaving.
Mm-hmm.
It just... So anyway, that's what I want to say is thank you, Skip. It's extremely enlightening. Yeah.
Well, in my case, I know how the tricks work, okay, because of personal experience. When my daughter told me, Dad, I think you're going to hell, boom, I dropped into hell at that moment. And on my way home, I had a visitation by Mephistopheles in my car. I mean, I actually had a vision of that. And so you can imagine in the Middle Ages with these pastors or priests preaching hell and damnation and, the fire and all that stuff, the sorts of things that Dante includes in the Divine Comedy. Because you already have those ideas in your mind one way or another, then they can actually manifest in the psyche, which fortunately for me, when that happened, I was already well into my Jungian studies, but if I hadn't been, and I didn't have an answer for it, you could easily drive off the road. I was going 65 miles an hour down the highway when it happened, and one wonders how it might have come up in people's lives 500 years ago, but that's how it came up in my life. And, I had a real vision of a real being, and it was real. There's no doubt about it. Fortunately, Mephistopheles has not returned after that one night, but I don't doubt that he could at some time, at some point. And so,
Did I tell you the story of the terrible pastor in Glen Burnie who drove a young man to suicide? I don't know. Did I tell you that story?
no.
The young man was homeless, had been thrown out of his house. He was a drinker, and the pastor was looking after him and had him stay at his house, and was trying to give him the Bible, give him the whole, Jesus saves, the whole biblical hard sell, and as well as trying to sober him up, but the sobering and the drinking was medicative. That the man was, needed some kind of medication, of analgesia of some kind. And well, anyway, the man eventually rejected this pastor's work, and the pastor cursed him, and he said, well, you will go to hell. You will absolutely, if you reject me, if you reject, you're rejecting God and all that is good. And anyway, I called the young man. I heard that somebody of his name had died, and I called him that same day. He had been seeing me a bunch of times for counseling sessions. So I got in touch with this pastor myself and tried to find out what was going on. And the pastor did the same mind trick with me. Once I had made it clear that I didn't need him or need his God, I was just trying to figure out what he was trying to do, what good he thought he was trying to do by bringing people to this strict evangelical, notion of the punishing God, the judgmental God. And he did the same thing. He cursed me. And the same thing, just like you said, you mentioned Mephistopheles. I went into a very dark place where I actively considered suicide. It was a curse that manifested the darkest things you can imagine. But again, thanks to people like you and my therapist and other people, I've done enough personal analysis and work to recognize a bad spirit when I see one.
That story is so poignant, because I don't know if you're familiar with Larry Dossey's work on prayer. But there's a concept in one of his, I can't remember the exact title of the book, but he dealt very specifically with prayer, of doctors performing medical hexing without realizing it, saying, I give you 6 months to live. And he looked through the data, and people would die on the day of the 6 months because they were told to. And so there's that impressionable quality with capital S suggestion that even the highest, most well-adjusted intellect can take us, T-boned in the intersection psychologically from the side and really get shaken up.
Yeah, I'm sure. And
I like, though, you put, medications, substances as psychological analgesics. He needed something to soothe. It's like I hate to say this, but, in track in high school, and someone puts analgesic in someone's jock, but it was a prank, but it's something to change the pain, to change the state of the pain. It doesn't mitigate it, but it does mask it. And that analgesic is that like you said, he needed some form of connection, and that was all he was getting.
Yeah.
And when that was taken away, and then he was hit with the curse, then he might as well have been stripped naked, tied up, and roasted on the fire, because he almost had no choice.
Well, there is a response that you can give, which I turned to Mephistopheles and said, you can have my immortal soul on my death, provided none of my daughters think that of me for the rest of my life. And that was the last time that I was ever confronted by any of them. So
look
far,
at that.
yeah. So-
the young man who killed himself, before he killed himself, made this for me.
Mhm.
Wow.
And
Wow.
he signed it. He said, it says on the back, for my friend Brendan Walls. And
Wow.
he made that. His father brought it in to me after he died. But his father brought it in 3 or 4 weeks after he died and said, oh, I found this in his bedroom. This is the young man here. This is the young fellow here.
Hmm.
Very sad.
Yeah, very
Michael
sad.
Malone.
A vulnerable young man.
Right. And so um,
Well, I would say in the other response too, besides the negotiation piece, is that when you receive that kind of curse, you stop and you look them all the way up and down and just say, and like, are you finished? I mean, it's like as if it's not a threat. But the thing is, that's a cloak because it actually was a threat.
Mhm.
I mean, you when you feel that, but you don't need to take it as being afraid.
well,
But
I don't think my daughter meant it as a threat. She said, I'm sorry to say this, but I think you're going to hell. That was her. She was saying an opinion, and it was late at night in the dark, so there wasn't any question of looking her up and down. Or
I was
this
talking about the
25.
Mephistopheles.
Yeah.
I mean,
well,
when your daughter said that, I have no response other than, that's crushing. I mean,
it is crushing. It is crushing, and it took me a decade to work out of it, honestly. And so, I know what these guys were doing for the last 2,000 years because of that, because it happened to me in that way. And, in that way and no other way. And,
Can we read another section from the book?
Yeah, go on, Nick. 107.
All right. In his book on energetics, Helm expresses the view that Robert Mayer's new idea did not detach itself gradually from the traditional concept of energy by deeper reflection on them, but belongs to those intuitively apprehended ideas which, arising in other realms of a spiritual nature, as it were, take possession of the mind and compel it to reshape the traditional conceptions in their likeness.
Really is what we've been saying.
And there's the projection too, to humanize, personify, and anthropomorphize things.
Absolutely.
So that we can understand them in our perspective.
Right. Okay, so I'll go on here. The question now arises: whence came this new idea that thrust itself upon consciousness with such elemental force? And whence did it derive the power that could so seize upon consciousness that it completely eclipsed the multitudinous impressions of a first voyage to the tropics? These questions are not so easy to answer, but if we apply our theory here, the explanation can only be this. The idea of energy and its conservation must be a primordial image that was dormant in the collective unconscious. Such a conclusion naturally obliges us to prove that a primordial image of this kind really did exist in the mental history of mankind and was operative through the ages. As a matter of fact, this proof can be produced without much difficulty. The most primitive religions in the most widely separated parts of the earth are founded upon this image. These are the so-called dynamistic religions, whose sole and determining thought is that there exists a universal magical power about which everything revolves. Tyler, the well-known English investigator, and Fraser likewise misunderstood this idea as animism. In reality, primitives do not mean by their power concept souls or spirits at all, but something which the American investigator Lovejoy has appropriately termed primitive energies. This concept is equivalent to the idea of soul, spirit, God, health, bodily strength, fertility, magic, influence, power, prestige, medicine, as well as certain states of feelings which are characterized by the release of effects. Among certain Polynesians, Mulungu, this same primitive power concept means spirit, soul, dynamism, magic, prestige, and when anything astonishing happens, the people cry out Mulungu. This power concept is also the earliest form of a concept of God among primitives, and is an image which has undergone countless variations in the course of history. In the Old Testament, the magic power glows in the burning bush and in the countenance of Moses. In the Gospels, it descends from the Holy Ghost in the form of fiery tongues from heaven. In Heraclitus, it appears as world energy, as ever-living fire. Among the Persians, it is the fiery glow of Hauma, divine grace. Among the Stoics, it is the original heat, the power of fate. Again, in medieval legend, it appears as the aura or halo, and it flares up like a flame from the roof of the hut in which the saint lies in ecstasy. In their visions, the saints behold the sun of this power, the plenitude of its light. According to the old view, the soul itself is this power. In the idea of the soul's immortality, there is implicit in its conservation. And in the Buddhist and primitive notion of metapsychosis, transmigration of souls is implicit, its unlimited changeability together with its constant duration. Okay, I'll stop there for the moment. That was a lot. Comments on that?
I'd like to read a passage from a book that applies to that, and then also Nick's previous comment where there's this narrative of characters. Mm-hmm. The passages, they're not listed by paragraphs, page 65 on the origin of consciousness in the breakdown of the bicameral mind by Dr. Julian Jaynes, a psychologist. And the paragraph is, if I ask you to think of a mountain meadow and a tower at the same time, you automatically conciliate them by having the tower rising from the meadow. But if I ask you to think of the mountain meadow and an ocean at the same time, conciliation tends not to occur, and you are likely to think of one and then the other. You can only bring them together by a narratization. Thus, there are principles of compatibility that govern this process, and such principles are learned and are based, here it goes, on the structure of the world. That seems to dial into both of those.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I look at the three of your images on my screen, the only one, well, very clearly, the only one I can very clearly see with an aura is Nick, which normally appears on a lighter background. I mean, I can see it a little bit with Jordan. I can't see it so much with Brendan because he has such a confused background behind his image, so it's hard to pick out the aura. But around Nick's head and shoulders, I see a tremendous aura of energy. Are you seeing it, Jordan, or
I'm
do you
seeing
see-
it.
Yeah.
There's it's a little bit purple on the periphery kind of thing, but mostly white.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I have to look to the side to see the purple around, but there is a glow.
Yeah. And Nick, can you see it in your own image?
I don't know, man.
Well, I mean, there's very obviously energetic light coming from your whole head and shoulders to me. And this isn't woo stuff. This is real stuff, okay, that these energetics, and we're talking about conservation of energy. There is energy that flows around us all the time that we actually give off, and so it is just coming out of us, not only in an image like that, but also there's an energy coming out of this discussion that as of now, just look at YouTube, as of now, 10 people are watching what we're talking about. And it's very easy to see. If I always teach people how to see an aura by looking at their fingers like this, and then separating them with a white background, and then move your fingers up and down, and you will see this taffy that goes up and down between your fingers, which is the energy between your fingers. If you do this and you look at it with a white background, you very clearly see it.
I find it's interesting. I teach it with people asking me why I have my lights on during the day on my table. And I say subtlety and nuance. To see the light in the light is actually pretty difficult. And it's important so that if you look askance and start to pick up on that which is there out of the side or the top or the bottom of your eyes, and then slowly move back and notice it was there, but it was so subtle that you weren't expecting to see it, so you don't notice it. But then once you see it off from the side, you look back and go, oh, the back of his wall is lightening and darkening. There's kind of almost a strobe flash of dark and then light, and it is pulsing though in a shape around halo-ish, and basically the halo concept.
Yeah, and this is where the halo concept
came from, right?
Came from.
Yeah, right.
Very clearly. And artists could see it, and so anyway, it relates to the conservation of energy and the fact that there is energy there around us all the time. I don't know that how you can use it, but nonetheless, it is there.
So shall I read 109?
Yes, go ahead.
Paragraph 109. So this idea has been stamped on the human brain for eons. That is why it lies ready to hand in the unconscious of every man. That way it lies ready to hand in the unconscious of every man. Only certain conditions are needed to cause it to appear. These conditions were evidently fulfilled in the case of Robert Mayer. The greatest and best thoughts of man shape themselves upon these primordial images upon a blueprint. Simply footnote. No, that's not the footnote yet. I have often been asked where the archetypes or primordial images come from. It seems to me that their origin can only be explained by assuming them to be deposits of the constantly repeated experiences of humanity. One of the commonest and at the same time most impressive experiences is the apparent movement of the sun every day. We certainly cannot discover anything of the kind in the unconscious, so far as the known physical process is concerned. What we do find, on the other hand, is the myth of the sun hero in all its countless variations. It is this myth, and not the physical process, that forms the sun archetype. The same can be said of the phases of the moon. The archetype is a kind of readiness to produce over and over again the same or similar mythical ideas. Hence, it seems as though what is impressed upon the unconscious were exclusively the subjective fantasy ideas aroused by the physical process. We may therefore assume that the archetypes are recurrent impressions made by subjective reactions. Footnote 11 just references the CF Structure of the Psyche book. Naturally, this assumption only pushes the problem further back without solving it. There is nothing to prevent us from assuming that certain archetypes exist, even in animals, that they are grounded in the peculiarities of the living organism itself, and are therefore direct expressions of life whose nature cannot be further explained. Not only are the archetypes apparently impressions of ever repeated typical experiences, but at the same time, they have empirically like agents that tend towards the repetition of these same experiences. For when an archetype appears in a dream, in a fantasy, or in life, it always brings with it a certain influence or power by virtue of which it either exercises a numinous or a fascinating effect, or impels to action. Thoughts, comments?
Well, I just want to firstly say that, I noticed that in conversation, we generally tend to not necessarily comment directly on the stuff that we're reading in the paragraph. And it's not even that I have anything to say necessarily, but I find that most of the time after we read something, it's like, yep, okay, sounds true.
Yeah, it sparks. Yeah, we're kind of like nodding, like, okay, let's keep going, because it was just one of
I mean, it sounds like it's extremely profound, but at the same time, it's just like, yeah, okay. I mean,
that's what's interesting. The first time I read Jung, I had a similar feeling where I just went, oh, and I didn't write that. Well, I didn't have the knowledge. I didn't have the expertise. I didn't have that dimension. But it was so, I mean, where he just said something that I had probably felt. Oh, I guess Skip dropped out. That he wrote something that I had felt. But he put it in such clear, concise, and then long form paragraph terms. That I'd nod, like you said, you're like, it's just, that's true. Okay. Wow. I mean, I hate to use the DUH, duh, but I have that word happen a lot with Jung, where I'm just going,
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult for me to say anything. Like, there's a part of me that kind of wants to refute some of this, but at the same time, I mean, it's not like I'm seeing 25 patients a week or clients a week or anything like that. It's hard for me to say. So the only thing that I can really offer up are my comments and thoughts on the theory, or my personal experience, which I don't know how well that scales to what's being said in the book. One thing that I do find interesting on that note in terms of the theory here is that what he's saying is that rather than archetypes being innate and inborn, they're the impression stamped upon the unconscious from external physical processes, which is kind of strange.
Well, yes. And something I just noticed here, even in his symphonies of paragraphs, as they are, or arias as they were, the last half of the last sentence is usually a finale. And if I went through all of this and only said, in which it either exercises a numinous or fascinating effect or impels to action, there's my forensic. There's how I know this has occurred, where I had a numinous experience, or I was simply fascinated, or it caused me to act. I think right there's this whole embrace the whole paragraph in that last little piece of how we know feel, see, live all the previous part of the paragraph. So he's like elucidating, but then he drops out, basically he drops off the microscope and goes back to out here. And it's not 400x anymore. He's not in the fine grain of detail. And then numinous, fascinating, or action. And that kind of circles back around to the, okay, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like in broad strokes, it's not that hard for me to accept a lot of what Jung says. But as we get into the finer detail, I do find myself with a lot of questions. It's not to say that it's an adequate refutation of some of the stuff, because I can't pretend to understand it. But at the same time, it also seems like there's a claim on the part of Jung, and also I've heard or read Robert Johnson say something similar, and Eric Neumann as well, that language and consciousness developed out of the unconscious, or developed out of the dialectic between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. Like, of course, my immediate response is like, how the hell would you know that? But okay. But then I have to ask the question here. It's like, at what point, let me just read a section and then ask the question here. Find the line. So at the beginning of 109, 3 or 4 lines down, he says, it seems to me that their origin can only be explained by assuming them to be the deposits of the constantly repeated experiences of humanity. And then further, probably 3 or 4 lines below that, the archetype is a kind of readiness to produce over and over again the same or similar mythical ideas. Hence, it seems as though what is impressed upon the unconscious were exclusively the subjective fantasy ideas aroused by the physical process. So, I mean, it's like on the one hand, he's saying they're paradigmatic and they're generative, but it's just so strange that I don't understand how one could just be kind of going along without consciousness or without a conscious mind, and then suddenly through all these physical processes, that's just born out of that, or archetypes are impressed within the mind of the person, and then that gives rise to consciousness. I don't understand it personally.
I have to say, I love your skepticism, Nick. I don't know. I mean, I've been very bad at attending recently. So the last time I saw you, I think, was in one of the tarot sessions. But you also, Nick, you are a clinician?
No, I'm just a student right now.
You're a student of or what? Psychology or what?
Yeah.
And I love the fact that you're probably, well, I don't know what Jordan's background is, but I love the fact that you're, as a student, you're confronted, hopefully challenged by dozens of different sources. Mm-hmm. And for someone like me, who's an armchair what's it called?
Armchair psychologist.
Armchair psychologist. But what's the other word? When you're is it called pop psychology or pop? When you prescribe people advice and you don't know a damn thing about it. I can't remember what it's called.
Bartender.
Bartender. All right, yeah. So speaking as a bartender and a pop psychologist, I think it's fantastic that you are skeptical of all this Jungian stuff, because I have to say, when I first started hearing about Skip and attending his weekly sessions at the bar around the corner from where he lives, it answered all my needs. I'd just come out of a divorce and I was living alone for the first time in 20 years. It just met all my needs, along with my therapist. I just felt like in the happiest place in my life. So I just took this Jungian stuff, hook, line, and sinker. And then when I heard the stories, one of you guys, mentioned about what a philanderer Jung was and how many, he liked to fuck his patients when he'd finished, dealing with them. I thought, wow, he's a really bad guy. And I mean, I know that we all have behaviors that we're not proud of, but it seemed to me that Jung did this with abandon. Just thought it was one of the perks of the job was to get in the sheets with his patients. So I don't know enough about psychology. I like so much of what Jung has written, and I guess I just just take it all as, yeah, it's probably right. I know very little. I know very little. Okay, so Skip's coming back. So
yeah. I'm glad that some of the skepticism is not falling on deaf ears completely. And I also just want to say that strangely, that's my way of showing appreciation for a certain tradition or a certain school of thought, is to be skeptical. And my thinking is that if it's something that really has some value, some merit, some truth, then it will stand up to some kind of criticism or skepticism. And I find that to largely be the case with Jungian thought as well. Of course, I appreciate a ton of Jungian thought, but there are some nuances that I find a little bit strange and sometimes difficult to accept, particularly in mostly and again, maybe it's a product of me not being somebody who's working in the field, working with people and hearing people give accounts of their own dreams and fantasies and stuff like that. But there are times where Jungians say very confidently, this is what's in the unconscious. We know it's there, as if it's like a place that they've been to and have their flashlight in there and they're looking around and see that there's all of this order and all of this stuff. And it's like, I don't know about that. That's
Nick, I appreciate Brendan, you two going into his skepticism, because to me, I value your skepticism for two words. It indicates to reflect. You're not reacting. And even before you respond, you're reflecting, you're sifting, you're steeping, you're yes and no, maybe, okay, that's a dynamic. It's like a geometry proof. You can skip steps and get there, and you still got there. But the thing is, you're doing the thought work. You're not just accepting it out of hand because Jung said it, which is honestly to me wonderful, because the worst thing someone can be is starstruck, because then that's cultish and not culture. And I have to say, I had the same skepticism, and I had the advantage at the point when I had it of being an architect while reading about alchemy. And then I'm presented with the concept of the unsquared circle, just nothingness. That's pure unconscious. But as soon as you draw a line across it, or two for direction, then you have the self. That's the circle is literally squared. It has 4 quadrants, the third being the creative wellspring. Okay, that's all great conceptually in a diagram. But then I'm still like, how do you know that this came from that? And one day I'm using my 100-year-old antique compass, and I put the point down on the paper and I start drawing the circle, and the Ouroboros comes to mind, and I stop drawing the circle. And I go, wait, the circle has no beginning and end. And then I went, wait, but not yet. And so I finished drawing the circle. And as soon as the lead crossed the first point and made a circle, now it has no beginning and end. But on the process of drawing that, even the unsquared circle, I went, aha, oh, it does come from that. I see. But it was this little diagram that actually might be unrelated to the actuality of how they figured it out, or even unrelated to even proving or disproving any of it. But I had the same skepticism, and I got stopped in my tracks of all mundane things while I'm doing a drawing of a house, working on some plans, and I use the compass. So that there was this, before the circle was a circle, it was just an arced line. And somehow that process was the becoming of knowing of this came from that. So Skip raised his hand, I think.
Yeah, I just want you to be aware that I can see and hear everything. Maybe you can hear me, but I
Yes.
got pushed out, and I don't know how and why, but
We've got choppy seas. You fell overboard.
yeah, I guess so. But I'm being dragged along by my foot, and so
we will pull you back on.
Right.
We'll throw
Okay.
chum on the other side, so you don't.
Can
You're
anybody
not
see
paid.
whether? Can anybody see whether the YouTube chat is still going?
It says live on YouTube.
All right.
Yeah, I see
Okay.
live on YouTube at the top of our chat here, but I can go to YouTube and see if
Yeah, I can see
everything's still going on YouTube.
I can see it's still there then.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just will not be visible, but I can be heard. Carry on.
You're the voice of God here.
There's one more thing that I want to add.
I'll be right back.
Okay, well, I guess I'll wait until Jordan's back because it was pertinent to something that he just said. But in any event, we can continue here with the text. So let's see. We're at 110. So I'll take this one out.
Okay.
Having shown in this example how new ideas arise out of the treasure house of primordial images, we will proceed to the further discussion of the transference process. We saw that the libido had for its new object seized upon the seemingly absurd and singular fantasies, the contents of the collective unconscious. As I have already said, the projection of primordial images upon the doctor is not a danger to be underrated at this stage of the treatment. The images contain not all the fine and good things that humanity has ever thought and felt, but the worst infamies and devilries of which men have been capable. Owing to their specific energy, for they behave like highly charged, autonomous centers of power, they exert a fascinating and possessive influence upon the conscious mind and can thus produce extensive alterations in the subject. One can see this in religious conversions, in cases of influence by suggestion, and particularly at the onset of certain kinds of schizophrenia. Now, if the patient is unable to distinguish the personality of the doctor from these projections, all hope of an understanding is finally lost and a human relationship becomes impossible. But if the patient avoids the charybdis and he is wrecked on the scylla of introjecting these images, in other words, he ascribes their peculiarities not to the doctor, but to himself. This is just as disastrous. In projection, he vacillates between an extravagant and pathological deification of the doctor and a contempt bristling with hatred. In introjection, he gets involved in a ridiculous self-deification or else in a moral self-laceration. The mistake he makes in both cases from attributing to a person the contents of the collective unconscious. In this way, he makes himself or his partner either God or the devil. Here we see the characteristic effect of this archetype. It seizes hold of the psyche with a kind of primeval force, and it compels it to transgress the bounds of humanity. I'm going to stop right there because this paragraph goes on for the whole of the next page. So we'll just stop there and take up the rest in a second.
Okay, do you want me to read it, or you want to?
Well, I mean, I said we could stop in case anybody has a comment, but if not, I can just continue. I just figured since
Okay.
the whole page, we have
Do you have a comment?
Gosh, I don't know about you guys, but when I read, it's almost like I'm more focused on the words rather than the content of what is being said. So I very rarely have a comment as I'm coming off reading.
Okay.
Well, I appreciate you stopping right there because I think this is a binary paragraph. Not to mention it's 2 pages. But the one can see this, hold on. Where was it? Now, if the patient is unable to distinguish the personality of the doctor from these projections, I'll stop there. And then it seizes hold of the psyche with a kind of primeval force and compels it to transgress the bounds of humanity. So it's interesting there that if the patient is not able to distinguish there, it goes beyond. And actually the schizophrenia is, in a sense, less healed or less taken hold of or less addressed. So I appreciate you stopped right there, because to transgress the bounds of humanity, then the inflation, then the exaggeration, and the schizophrenic then looks up, and does all those tells. But it feels that when then the schizophrenic has basically absorbed the therapist to be part of the archetype and makes no distinction between the two, there's a serious problem that then arose that was actually beyond even the schizophrenia.
Yeah, I mean, one would hope that in the case of a healthy individual, it would be some kind of nascent self-consciousness or capacity for reflection that would be kind of the middle way in between both of these.
Yeah, but there's not that nascency. There's nothing asleep, so that it can't find that middle way to distinguish. It's almost like there's no corpus callosum. There's no split between the hemispheres of the brain in the patient between outer and inner. So there's a liminal boundary that does not exist, or a psychological property line of identity between two things. Even though they may be seamless, there's still you change lands in a way. I like the word nascent, middle way, where there's some unconscious, subconscious sleep, something asleep that would find that middle way to make the distinguishment or distinction.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that there seem to be two really tense poles here. On the one hand, it's like this person is projecting all of their inner contents onto the doctor and making that relationship impossible, not seeing human for what they are. In the other case, they claim all of that for themselves and then identify with that and think themselves to be either this God or this devil or what have you. And it seems like the path between each of those. It's funny that he uses the Charybdis and the Scylla from the Odyssey, but the path between each of those seems to be just saying, well, I'm not that, and he's not that, or she is not that either. It's just some crazy thing that's lurking below the threshold in my own mind.
Well, it is, and it right here in introjection, he gets involved in a ridiculous self-deification, or else in a moral self-laceration. So cutting himself up. Could be shamanic dismemberment, but this seems smaller. The mistake he makes in both cases comes from attributing to a person the contents of the collective unconscious. So this to me seems to transcend projection, where the contents of the unconscious, maybe he got uncomfortable, but he put them off on the doctor, made them the same thing. And that mistake then, that is this characteristic effect of the archetype, where it transgresses the bounds of humanity, because it's one thing to put emotional projections on someone else, but the psychic contents, unconscious contents that come up, they're yours. They can't go on someone else, even if they're archetypally similar. Your story is going to be subtly different. That this round peg square hole kind of thing.
It's difficult to say, because there are definitely contradictions across Jung's body of work and then within Jungians as well. Because on the one hand, it's like you have a ton of people who work with your dreams, and that's essentially a process of integrating stuff from the unconscious into the conscious mind for personal growth, or for self-development, or something like that. That's the process in a nutshell. But then here he's saying you should not project that onto the doctor, nor should you identify yourself with it. So,
because they always say, do not identify with an archetype lest you be dissolved. I mean, that's the dissolution aspect that's a problematic, where you can experience it but don't identify with it, because that's inflation. That's exaggeration. And it's also futile that you're basically just throwing yourself into a choppy sea.
Yeah, there is a comment on YouTube. B says, the passage about distinguishing one's own projections from the analyst, does this indicate that transference is meant to exist according to Jung? Jungian analysis has, in my view, been transactional and or two-person psychology. Would you agree? Or how much emphasis does Jung put on transference and what its reasons, roots are?
I think we covered last week or the week before that Jung is very much in support of the projection and transference of the client onto the doctor, as that's where the magic happens, because they confess in a way and to show what's going on inside their psyche.
Right. So
it's funny, he like affirms both, because we did talk about it in an earlier chapter, or maybe just an earlier page of this chapter. But he says on the one hand, it's befitting of a good analysis to enter into a transference, but at the same time, he doesn't find it altogether necessary.
Right, because the healthy person will realize this is mine rather than transfer it. But on the process to getting to be that self-health or self-made healthy person, the projection and transference was probably going to be one of the sequential tools of the process. Whereas, like you said, it's not necessary. I mean, if I know this came up in my mind and, well, I have the boundary to go, well, this is mine. This is not yours. I have to deal with this. Now I'm going to share it with you so you can help me deal with it. But I'm not going to put it on you as if, here, help me do my work. I mean, I think there's a distinction there between someone who's going to own it, or actually someone who has the ability to own it. Because if I get out of my judgy, someone who has the ability through their process to own it, regardless of the comfort level of it or discomfort level of it, versus someone who's along the process to get to that place where they can learn that it's okay to own it.
Right. Okay. In terms of where this came from, I think it came from Freud. I mean, Freud was talking about transference before Jung came along, I think. And I think Jung just confirmed it.
He did, but there's a difference. There's a kind of subtle difference. Whereas Freud, the transference was certainly encouraged, but it was never necessarily broken or discontinued. Where I think Jung realized it might be necessary, or maybe it's not altogether necessary, but it is certainly a helpful component to analysis, if only you can eventually give it back to a person, if you can break.
Right. Yes, and he does talk about that at one point, talking about the young girl who starts to see him as her father, and go ahead.
I know you've kind of jokingly said before, analysis is a process of entering into it and then being in it for years and years and years and years, and maybe never getting out of it, seeing somebody once a week or something. That is particularly true, as I understand it, at least, kind of anecdotally, of Freudian analysis or psychoanalysis, where oftentimes you go see a Freudian analyst multiple times a week, and you enter into that transference, and it may not ever be broken or discontinued. But in Jungian thought, while it might take a long time, the ultimate end of things is for it to be broken. So 5 years compared to a lifetime sounds like a short amount of time.
Well, and I would concur with that 100%, because to me, most Freudian psychotherapy is shame-based. You hit the sales pitch to come back because, oh my God, are you still alive? Well, you need to do some work. Whereas Jung's premise was he wants to teach you how to live yourself. So basically, it's time for you to take your 6-month sabbatical and go out and do this on your own. So Jung was not shaming. He was saying these contents come up. Okay, they came up. So what? Let's look at them. Whereas Freud's going to come up and say, oh, this is indicative of this problem and that problem. He goes, and it gets to me to be granular flypaper psychologically with Freudian psychology. Whereas with Jung, he's teaching the art of living. I mean, in a sense, the psychological Dalai Lama. He doesn't want you to have to use his counseling. He wants you to emerge and hatch from it into adulthood, basically, where you take care of your own life.
There's a really great compilation of Jung's essays on dreams called Dreams. I think it's an addendum to the collected works. But in that, he talks about how he would use dreams in analysis. And he's saying towards the end of one of the essays that he was not only working with dreams, but he was always teaching people who came to see him how to do this for themselves, so they could take it home and do it. They didn't have to come see him forever.
Right. And so
and
B
then they
says,
make their own. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, B says, agree with Nick, hence my question, because I find myself confused when it comes to transference according to Jung, especially if it's clinically valuable and how it's been utilized. Perhaps it's my incompetence here, but I find Jung to describe a somewhat ambivalent approach in regards to this. Well, first of all, I think we have to say that none of us are Jungian analysts, nor are any of us mental health professionals. and so anything that we say here is subject to that caveat. However, you want to comment, Nick, since...
Well, it's interesting. I know that we've kicked around a couple of the ideas from the Red Book, and this is just making me think of something that I read in the footnotes, where he's talking about ambiguity, and I think it's the section called Confronting the God, something like that. And he says, I write intentionally ambiguously because life lives in ambiguity. And, stuff to that effect. I can't recall the quote exactly, but I think that, even though he's talking about his writing in the Red Book, particularly there, I think that's true of a lot of his work, where you can never figure out exactly where he stands. And he's certainly a multivalence to what he's saying about transference, affirming on the one hand that it's not altogether necessary, and in other places affirming that it's the most viable way to conduct an analysis.
And I would add to that, to respond directly to B's comment of the ambivalence. I see, hear, feel, and respect that you would say ambivalent, but I think that's contrasting Freud in a way that that doesn't stick, because Freud's more empirical. He's going to give you an answer, and of course, an answer that requires ... ellipses, and you have to come back next week. Jung is, rather than ambivalent, I think is looking to get you to learn subtlety and nuance in your own way, in your own life, which is not ambivalent, it's ongoing, lifelong. So Freud seems to me sometimes to make too much sense to be worth a damn. And it is like squeeze the meaning out of it, squeeze the life out of it. And Jung is giving that ambiguous place that is open for you to connect, and then you put your train car on and you move down the track your own way, from my perspective. But I think the ambivalence is a good word to lead into that, but I think it's actually not ambivalence. I think it's, I'm not going to tell you how to live your life. You're going to learn how to live your life, and I'm going to give you suggestions, tools, tips, and such.
I think that's my experience, because I never talked to any analyst or mental health professional. I only read Jung's books and a couple of Freud's books and got to where we are tonight. And so, I think we have to make our own judgment about how these things apply to our own lives. And it's perfectly possible. I mean, as one of our famous Jungians said, you're a thin person, Skip, and Jung was your your shrink. Well, Jung is my shrink. And so I go through, line by line, and do a lot of underlining and tabbing and so on. Not because I would necessarily ever go back to those things, and sometimes I do, but because it makes me think more deeply about it before I move on.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting to me, the next part of this paragraph, Jung takes a very, very cloaked and oblique but direct shot at Nietzsche, and in an intellectual humor way. I mean, Nick, would you continue?
Yeah.
From the causes, but listen to this in the context of when he goes through this. I mean, Occidentalis is West, not Orient. So go through and read this, but think about Zarathustra and Nietzsche, and this to me is one of the funniest. He's just turning around and taking a shot at Nietzsche.
Yeah, I mean, he is at certainly no point completely departed from including Nietzsche in the conversation. I mean, like since there was the chapter on Nietzsche, he's made almost constant reference to him.
But this one is actually intellectually, I think, humorous. It's funny. I mean, because it's oblique and it's abstract-ish, but he's basically sticking his tongue out at it.
All right.
Yeah.
It causes exaggeration, a puffed up attitude, inflation, loss of free will, delusion, and enthusiasm in good and evil alike. That is the reason why men have always needed demons and cannot live without gods, except for a few particularly clever specimens of Homo Occidentalis who lived yesterday or the day before, supermen for whom God is dead, because they themselves have become gods, but 10 gods with thick skulls and cold hearts. The idea of God is an absolutely necessary psychological function of an irrational nature, which has nothing whatever to do with the question of God's existence. The human intellect can never answer this question, still less give any proof of God. Moreover, such proof is superfluous, for the idea of an all-powerful divine being is present everywhere, unconsciously, if not consciously, because it is an archetype. There is in the psyche some superior power, and if it is not consciously a God, it is the belly, at least, in St. Paul's words. I therefore consider it wiser to acknowledge the idea of God consciously, for if we do not, something else is made God, usually something quite inappropriate and stupid, such as only an enlightened intellect could hatch forth. Our intellect has long known that we can form no proper idea of God, much less picture to ourselves in what manner he really exists, if at all. The existence of God is once and for all an unanswerable question. The consensus gentum has been talking of gods for aeons and will still be talking of them aeons hence. No matter how beautiful and perfect man may believe his reason to be, he can always be certain that it is only one of the possible mental functions and covers only that one side of the phenomenal world which corresponds to it. But the irrational, that which is not agreeable to reason, brings about it on all sides. And the irrational is likewise a psychological function. In a word, it is the collective unconscious, whereas the rational is essentially tied to the conscious mind. The conscious mind must have reason, firstly, to discover some order in the chaos of disorderly individual events occurring in the world, and secondly, to create order, at least in human affairs. We are moved by the laudable and useful ambition to extirpate the chaos of the irrational, both within and without, to the best of our ability. Apparently, the process has gone pretty far. As a mental patient once told me, "Doctor, last night I disinfected the whole heavens with biochloride of mercury, but I found no God." Something of the sort has happened to us as well. Yeah, I mean, that's funny, and I want to laugh, but at the same time, I want to cry.
Yeah, it's both. I mean, yeah, but when he started off with Nietzsche and then ended up with the client who disinfected heaven with black chloride of mercury. I mean, you're right. I want to laugh. I'm laughing, but at the same time, it's like, wow, that's sad.
God, that's painful. Yeah. Sorry to pull the fun out of that one a little bit, but sheesh,
no, but even in the line, but I found no God. Well, it's not a thing to find, so it's, yeah, the both and is.
But it's not the
go ahead.
lack of God that makes me so sad in what we just read. That's just that there's heaviness that comes with that comment that's like a little bit funny, but at the same time there's a confusion and a lostness that's just painful.
Well, I found a sentence this week that really might be helpful. It's in Liberating the Heart, Spirituality and Jungian Psychology. And it's one sentence that summarizes Jungian psychology. And it's by Lawrence Jaffe, who was the son of Aniela Jaffe, who did Memories, Dreams, Reflections. She was the scribe. But anyway, the sentence reads, "The purpose of Jung's whole psychology is to make accessible to us that healing power which resides in our unconscious." Very simply. And so some people call that God, some people don't, but nonetheless, it's the healing power that is essential.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really nice.
Could you read that again?
Yep. I'll probably read it 1,000 times in the next 10 years. The purpose of Jung's whole psychology is to make accessible to us that healing power which resides in our unconscious. Okay, now in the unconscious, Edinger talks about the God image and all that stuff. We don't have to project on Jung's work anything about God if we don't want to. It's just very practical. The unconscious has a healing power, and when you're in trauma, it will try to heal you. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really interesting too that both in the quote from Robert Mayer, which I don't know who that is, frankly, apart from having read it in this book, who came up with the idea of conservation of energy and was a physician. Both in what I just read and what you said and other letters that Jung wrote, it's really interesting that he always talks about being opposed to metaphysics. I know that in that quote from Robert Mayer, he said, unless one prefers to work at things from the metaphysical side, which I find infinitely disgusting. Yeah, in some ways he contradicts himself because he uses the word inspired, which means something more or less metaphysical. But anyways, it's interesting because I guess it's like, I don't know what the opposite of metaphysical is. I mean, I know metaphysics is above physics, but if there were some inversion of metaphysics, I wonder if it would be like phenomenology or something like that. Jung is certainly a phenomenologist, but it's easy to read about all this stuff and think, wow, this is metaphysics. I mean, this sounds exactly like metaphysics.
Well,
it does.
And I'm not saying that it is. I just think it's interesting because he always is dealing in the image of God or the image of the archetypes and all the stuff being contained within the person. So it's not metaphysics. It does sound like metaphysics, and it kind of has the stench of metaphysics. But at the same time, I mean, I know that Jung was very much a Kantian as well. And in some letters, I think that he wrote to Martin Buber, he says very forthrightly, like, if you knew how much of a Kantian I was, you would know that I do not believe in metaphysics at all.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that brings up to me, what's your question is really good one, a really good one. What's the opposite? What's the counter of metaphysics? And, comes to mind first existentialism. And then I think, no, that doesn't fit. And then I think solipsism, which is the philosophy that only the self exists and nothing else. And then I'd say no, but then all of a sudden nihilism, NIHI, comes up, and I'm like, that doesn't fit either. So that's a really good question of what's the opposite of metaphysics.
Let
Yeah.
me read the entire paragraph that sentence comes out of.
Let me throw one thing in here really quickly, and then I'll
Okay.
shut up and let you read that. But I think you're onto something with the existentialist thing or existentialism bit, because a bit ago when he was talking about, and we were kicking around the notion of the archetypes being impressed upon the psyche or the unconscious from external physical processes, he's essentially making the quintessential existential claim right there, saying that existence precedes essence.
Yeah, I think therefore I am. I mean, so you get
Well,
that existence precedes essence, yes, because there can be no essence established as an identity until the existence occurs. So yeah, existence precedes essence.
yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to take exception. I just have different associations to the Cartesian thing, but all the same, let's hear what Skip has to say.
Yeah, I wanted to go to a poem by Holderlin, if I can find the poem.
Well, real quick too, I think you're right on the money, Nick, with the Descartes piece, because if I say I think, therefore I am, that's actually the reverse of existence precedes essence.
Yeah.
You know, and it's actually completely just flipping it. So it's Pat's in this order, one to the other, but I think your existence precedes essence is actually more apt. And then I think, therefore I am would be a subset that comes off of that. I mean, a thought or a development, but existence precedes essence is more simple and more basic and more DNA structure of the philosophy there.
And it's so funny too, because like Martin Heidegger and Nietzsche and Sartre, I mean, those are all the first existentialists. And it's like he's refuting Nietzsche, but at the same time, like he's making very similar claims to Nietzsche.
Very much. And actually with Heidegger, if you think Jung is wordy, like Jung could write a letter to his mama to say I love you, and it'd be 90 pages long. I mean,
sure. Well, let me just read this point out of Holderlin's poem Patmos, Patmos. I urge you all to look it up online, and it's Friedrich Holderlin, and the key idea here is that God is near yet hard to seize. Where there is danger, the rescue power as well. Eagles live in the darkness. And Jung often referred to the rescuing power. And so now I'll read this full paragraph. And keep in mind that Jung was always talking about the transcendent function. That is to have a communication between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, to open up that stream of communication. And so here's the paragraph. The religious attitude of reflection, and this reflection is an idea that Edward Edinger kept bringing up over and over. The religious attitude of reflection, or careful consideration of the conflicts which life offers us, promotes the work of the transcendent function. Thus, Jung says of his psychology that it only helps us to find the way to the religious experience that makes us whole. The purpose of Jung's whole psychology is to make accessible to us that healing power that resides in our unconscious.
and he then the two words to reflect, then that literally reflects the transcendent function of the conversation between the conscious and the unconscious.
Right. And Edinger in his various lectures didn't say that explicitly, but he repeatedly said in answer to questions in Q&A after his lectures, when people asked, well, how do you do this? And he says, well, you have to reflect on it.
Right. So then just simple infinitive, to reflect. It's a very verb, very active introversion.
Yeah. And I think
Or introspection. Sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too, like at the same time, like I know that we've talked about this a little bit and we're kind of touching on some philosophy stuff, so I think it would be appropriate to bring it up now. But I mean, Jung's whole idea of the transcendent function is just Hegel's dialectic turned inwardly.
It sure is.
But
Okay.
That's a good point.
I mean, that's not. I mean, like that's by no means an original thought. Edinger has a whole chapter on that in Ego and Archetype, but it's just the whole notion of there being a thesis, whatever my conscious mind thinks about myself or something, and then there's the opposite, which is in the unconscious, and then there's the synthesis, which is created between bringing both those ideas together. So if I think God is good, well, maybe my unconscious thinks God is bad, so I have to say God is both good and bad.
God is certainly son of a gun.
You're right about with Hegel, because I mean that's just that dialectic of interdependency externally, except take that and turn it back inside, and there you go.
Okay, I'm going to give to all of you and to the YouTube audience links to various Edinger lectures that we'd like to get to, but we never seem to have a chance. And they are lectures that helped me really understand what Jung was about at some level. And geez, I have to figure out how to get this whole URL in here. But I'm putting them. Let's see if I can do this.
I'll just copy and paste and put them over in somewhere else.
Yeah, I don't know if this is going to work, but anyway, there's the link. You need the HTTPS for that one, which is the portable analytic hour. And I will put it here as well. These are all transcripts of things that I thought were important and therefore actually transcribed myself. And it took me days to do so. And
thanks for doing that.
I had to listen.
Thank you. And I bet you really learned a lot from doing that.
Well, not only did I learn a lot, I had to listen to these essays 10 times each before I started to grok them at all.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's easy, but basically the fundamental thing he's talking about here is the greater personality, what you're reflecting on in the greater personality. Let's see if I got all this to you. So those are worth reading through at the very least. In most cases, you can actually listen to the lecture that Edinger gives. But in the Jaffe and Edinger interview, unfortunately, that YouTube interview keeps disappearing. People keep forcing it off the internet. And so I said, okay, well, screw this. I'm going to just read it myself. And then it's mine and everybody can listen to it again. So let's see, that's the very first link I put there. So they're somewhat useful to listen to in terms of hearing Edinger on what Jung was talking about, but it's still all summed up in this one sentence, okay, which is how to reach the rescuing power, and the rescuing power is the unconscious. With me. Okay. Anyway, for what it's worth, have we gotten to a stopping point, or what should we do next?
I think as
Nick?
much as ever. We're
I
certainly.
think so.
Paragraph.
That 2-page paragraph, and then I think if we dial in further, I think we're going to open up a larger conversation that not going to take the 9 minutes we have left. I mean, it'll take a little more.
Okay, because the very next words in 111 are old Heraclitus. So
yeah, we're new paragraph.
Yeah, obviously a favorite of Nick's.
Oh, how funny!
Or is it a favorite of yours, Nick? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's funny. I recently went to, as you guys know, I love books. So
Yes.
I went to a thrift store here in Boone, next to where I work.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's like a Christian organization, so that heavily influences the books that they have on the shelf and stuff like that.
Right.
Every now and then I go in there and I find something good. I found a couple of a book on Plato there and a couple of other cool things. So I was looking through some of their furniture, trying to find myself maybe like a little end table or something like that. And I noticed that in one of the pieces of furniture, they have like a whole series of these really, really beautiful red leather-bound books. And it's a series, I want to say it's in Oxford, published by Oxford. It's a series of like the great writers of Greece, the great philosophers of Greece, the great thinkers of Rome, the great thinkers of the early Victorian period, and all stuff like that. So I got the one from Greece, and of course it's got a bunch of Plato, but it's got a bunch of the pre-Socratics as well. So it's got Parmenides, Empedocles, Heraclitus, and all of these other all of these other thinkers that were extremely influential on Plato and Aristotle and all the other people as well. So essentially what I'm saying is, yes, I do really like Heraclitus, but it's kind of funny that people talk about Heraclitus or any of those guys as if they left behind this huge body of work, because the only thing that's been found of their work are like fragments, which are essentially a page's worth of poems or something.
Yeah, and Parmenides is like one page.
Yeah, and the same with Heraclitus too. Yeah.
Herodotus was the volume.
It's very abstruse, and I do like it. And yes, I mean, I agree with Jung that an antiodromia is a psychological rule par excellence, but at the same time, it's like nobody really knows what the guy thought truly.
Well, I laughed.
Well, that's right.
You went to that used bookstore. The Somos bookstore was here, which is the Society of the Muse of the Southwest. They have a psychology section, but the thing is, all the books are donated. And all the books are $1 for a paperback, $2 for a special edition, or $3 for a hardback. So it's just a donation. But I mean, I got a whole pile of books for $8 a couple of weeks ago. And what's interesting in this one was I finally replaced my Origin of the Consciousness breakdown of the bicameral mind, because about 10 years ago, someone else decided from my library that they needed it more than me. And I, it was fine to borrow it, but they never brought it back. I laugh though. I just noticed inside is this Christmas card on page 219 from this one family to another. So I thought it's funny that here we come upon the season and I open it up and there's a Christmas card in there. And I got this 2 weeks ago and I finally just cracked it back open today. So, I like your story of, with the table and here the volumes. You just have this treasure you find.
Yeah, and let me tell you also, it indeed was a treasure find, because the entire set of books had a tag on it for like $60 or something like that. I think it was like 10 volumes or maybe 12.
Wow.
And I went up to the counter and I was like, would you be willing to let me buy just one or two of these? And the guy was like, yeah, give me 75 cents. So I gave him 75 cents for one of the books. And then I went back the next day and I got another one. And it was from a set that was like, had a tag on it. I can't do that math right off the top, but it would have cost me at least $8 to $10 or something like that. 80 cents.
Gotta mortgage the house for
Good
that,
work,
you know?
Nick. That's
Yeah. Hey, I love a bargain.
that's
Yeah.
field expedient solution in
Oh my
Boone,
God.
North Carolina.
That reminds me of the dolly that I got at the Cuesta thrift shop. I walk up and it's 100 years old. Literally, it's steel. It's not racked at all. It's solid. It's been beaten up. Huge quality of use. Well, I'm just speechless. This thing is 100-year-old beauty. So I'm literally speechless. And the sticker says $135. And the owner walks up, and I look at him and smile, and I look back. I'm just steeping in this thing. He thinks I'm doing the passive aggressive silent negotiator thing. So after like 2 minutes, he goes, 90? And then I realized what he was doing, but I was still speechless. So I didn't look at him. I just kept looking at this. And about a minute later, 80? I'm like, I'll take it. But I laugh. I mean, I could have just sat there all day and had him pay me to take it or something. So it's a good job.
I'm gonna keep
75 cents. Man.
Yeah, it's crazy. On the one hand, I'm thankful that I could get a book like that for so cheap, but on the other, I'm just like, this is highway robbery. I mean, this is literally all of the great thinkers for like 1,000 years in Greece compiled into one convenient volume, and nobody
Right.
cares.
Nobody cares. Yeah,
benefit from
yeah.
that wisdom.
Mhm. Well, instead of highway robbery, just call it legal theft.
Yeah, I for years, probably 20 years, I wanted to buy the Great Books, which is a big set that
I've got
was
them.
published by somebody. And
Yeah, I've got the ones. I think mine's Encyclopedia Britannica. Let's see. Yeah, Encyclopedia Britannica. I've got Plato, Plotinus, Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel. Not all of them, but a great deal of them.
So as soon as I bought them, I divorced my wife and she kept them.
Oh, goodness.
Very painful. Very painful.
Yeah, the tears on that one.
Yeah, that hurts.
And I know she's never opened a single one of them, but that's that's the way it goes.
Yeah, and they're expensive too. I mean, I got all of these books for really cheap. I mean, those I got all of those in the haul that I told you guys about a couple of months ago for probably 75 cents a piece or something like that. Maybe But when I got home, I looked up the whole set to see if you could just buy them online, and yeah, I think they're in between $500 and $1,000, if not more.
Wow, incredible
set, which is probably 50 or more books. Yeah, I mean, this one goes up to Freud and begins with Homer, and it's 54 volumes. So it's a lot of books.
It's a lot of books.
That's a lot of books. I remember South Broadway, the used bookstore and antique row, plus they have the antiquarian bookshop. Now, the antiquarian bookshop has plenty of books with commas in the price, right? But then the normal used bookstore is right next door. And right around Christmas, I noticed every year for 4 years, I was eating lunch across the street. This woman would go in and she would buy like 4 super rare first edition, deckled edged, 200-year-old, books. And she'd walk out and she'd look right and she'd look left. And there was the free bin of paperbacks and, mass market this from whenever. And she would push them and she would stick them in. And so if someone actually stopped to look, they would find these, $3,000 books. And, I remember crossing the street really fast and this guy ran up and was gone. Like, oh, I'm not the only one watching. It's like, I should eat lunch on the same side of the street next year.
Quick.
Yeah, I got to eat lunch on the same side of the street next year. So,
and if we had an antiquarian bookshop here, I would be broke as a joke.
Oh man, Denver, it's a beautiful shop. I mean, you walk into a giant Indian room of just dark stained shelves and old leather chairs, and there's a cat sitting on top of a pile of, and
naturally.
Yeah. big rust-colored 18-pound huge tomcat, and he's just hanging out. So, wow. I think they just form.
everyone,
The
well,
existence precedes essence. Antiquarian bookshop forms, and the cat appears.
So everyone, I'm not sure I can shut down this thing because I seem to be here as a guest or something, but I am going to leave at this time and try to find my way into Zoom so I can shut you down. So
I can press end. I mean, I don't know if that will end the whole thing, but I guess we'll see.
did it make you a co-host?
Co-host?
Yeah, when you were
We all
kicked, it said
co-host.
okay, gotcha.
Is
I
that
don't know
what
if there's
happened?
I don't know if there's any difference, but when you were kicked, it said I was the host now.
Oh, okay. So you can end it.
You
then.
can just end meeting for all. Yeah.
Yeah. Good night.
Good night.
Yeah.
Good to see you,
Good
Brendan.
night.
All right,
Nick,
bye, everybody.
let's skip.
Hey, Nick, one thing you could do for me is just check on people or something down at the bottom of the screen and click on that, and then look at whatever. There's two. Normally when I'm the host, I can see panelists and attendees.
Yeah, right. There are 3 panelists, myself included. It says host next to my name, and you are listed under the attendees. When I saw that you put your message into the chat here on Zoom, I went to attendees, clicked your name, and asked you to promote yourself to panelist. And that was the point at which we were able to hear you again, but we haven't been able to see you since then.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't know what happened, but anyway, here we are. Thanks.
Nascent video.
Thanks for filling in.
Yeah. Bye, everybody. See you next week.
Bye. Thank
See you
you.
next week.